Hey guys, Reese here from Psalm 71:17, and you're watching the book of 2 Samuel in 3 minutes. The book of 2 Samuel picks right back up where the book of 1 Samuel left off, that being the death of Saul. We once again see the good in King David, as he mourns the loss of Saul and his sons, even though Saul spent much of his later life trying to kill David. In chapter 2, we see two new kings anointed, David being anointed the king of Judah, and Ishbosheth being made king of Israel. The two countries go to war near the end of chapter 2, a war that continues all the way through chapter 4. After Ishbosheth is murdered, David, in chapter 5, becomes king over all of Israel and Judah. Chapters 5 and 6 go on to depict David's conquests as new king, from driving the Jebusites out of the capital of Jerusalem to defeating the Philistines in the valley of Rephaim. Chapter 7 even goes on to ensure achievements for David's children, when God tells David that a future seed of his will build him a temple. And though the early chapters of this book do show David as a good king of Israel, we also are shown that he is not a king without flaws. Chapter 11 gives us the infamous account of David, Bathsheba, and Uriah, in which David commits adultery with a woman named Bathsheba, before having her husband, Uriah, sent to the army and killed. God punishes David by sending a prophet named Nathan to show him the error of what he had done, and later on, God would take the child that Bathsheba bore to him. This sorrowful time, however, does have a bright spot within it, as later on in chapter 12, David has another son with Bathsheba, a boy by the name of Solomon. Solomon, of course, would go on to be a great king of Israel just like his father. However, the other children that we see of David, beginning in chapter 13, those being Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom, were not quite as good. Absalom and Amnon get into a feud over Tamar, and eventually Absalom would murder his half-brother. We then see Absalom spiral out of control beginning at the end of chapter 13, in which he flees from his hometown to Geshur. He returns in chapter 14 to receive David's forgiveness, but begins plotting treason in chapter 15. Absalom begins gaining a following to usurp the king, and eventually, later on in chapter 15, David is forced to flee from Jerusalem. Absalom is defeated, however, and later killed in chapter 18 when David rallies his troops and fights back against the usurper. We see David return home to Jerusalem in chapter 19. He is then forced to quash yet another rebellion, this time led by a man named Sheba in chapter 20. And though this book does a good job showing us David's flaws as well as his military prowess, we're also able to see the more human side of David, like in chapter 18 where he hears of Absalom's death and goes on to mourn, despite Absalom being his enemy, as well as in chapter 22, in which David gives all of the praise and glory once again to God. The book ends with a census that David takes of the people of Israel and Judah, with his final words, and with God's judgment on his sins.